Chapter 22. The Stadium of Tarns. I brought the tarn down behind the tiers in the Stadium of Tarns, in the readying compound of the Steels. I heard the warning bar for a race about to begin. As my bird, with a flash of wings, struck the sand of the compound, 4 men armed with crossbows rushed forward. "Hold!" I cried. "I am of the Steels." Each of those who charged wore upon his shoulder the greyish patch that betokened the faction. I found myself covered with their weapons. "Who are you?" cried one of them. "Gladius of Kos," I told them. "It may be," said one, "for he is of the size and build." The crossbows, though, were not lowered. "The tarn will know me," I said. I leapt from the back of the tarn I rode, and ran through the compound toward the perch of the black tarn. Midway I stopped. Near one perch there lay a dead tarn, a small racing tarn, its throat cut. Near it, being tended for wounds, lay its intended rider, groaning. I knew the man. His name was Callias. "What's this?" I cried. "We enjoyed a visit by the Yellows," said one of the men grimly. "This tarn was slain, and the rider was direly wounded. We beat them off." Another of the men gestured with his crossbow menacingly. "If you not be Gladius of Kos, you will die." "Do not fear," I said, and grimly strode toward the perch where I knew would be the great black tarn, the majestic tarn of Koribar, my Ubar of the skies. Approaching him, we heard a wild tarn scream of hate and challenge, and we stopped. I beheld in its compound, strewn about its perch, more than 5 men, or the remains of such. "Yellows," said one of the men with the crossbow, "who tried to slay the bird." "It's a war tarn," said another. I saw blood on the beak of the bird, its round black eyes gleaming wild. "Beware," said one of the men, "even if you do be Gladius of Kos, for the tarn has tasted blood." I saw that even the steel-shod talons of the bird were blooded. Watching us warily, it stood with one set of talons hooked over the body of a yellow. And then, not taking its eyes from us, it put down its beak and tore an arm from the thing beneath its talons. "Do not approach," said one of the men. I stood back. It isn't wise to interfere with the feeding of a tarn. I heard the judge's bar ringing 3 times, signalling tarns to the starting perches. I heard the crowd roar. "Which race is it?" I asked, suddenly afraid I might be too late. "The 8th," said one of the men. "That before the Ubar's race." "Callias was to have ridden this race," I said. But Callias lay wounded, his tarn was dead. "We stand 1 race behind at the beginning of the 8th," said one of the men. My heart sank. With Callias wounded and tarns at or near their perches, the Steels would have no rider. My own tarn, if it could be readied at all, could not be brought to the starting perches before the 9th race, that of the Ubar. The Steels could not thus, even if they did win the Ubar's race, carry the day. "The Steels are done for," I said. "But one rides for the Steels," said one of the crossbowmen. I looked at him suddenly. "Mip," he said. "The little town-keeper?" I asked sceptically. "Hey," said the man. "But what mount?" I queried. "His own. Green Ubar." I was stunned. The bird is old. It hasn't raced for years." I looked at them. "And Mip, though he knows much of racing, is but a town-keeper." One of the men looked at me and smiled. Another lifted his crossbow, levelling the weapon at my breast. "He is perhaps a spy of the Yellows," he said. "Perhaps," agreed the leader of the crossbowmen. "How do we know you be Gladius of Kos?" And I smiled. "The tarn will know me," I said. "The tarn has tasted blood," said the leader. "It has killed. It feeds. Don't approach the tarn now, or it will mean your death." We have little time to waste, I said. Wait, cried the leader of the crossbowmen. I stepped toward the great black tarn. It was at the foot of its perch. It was chained by 1 foot. The run of the chain was perhaps 25 feet. I approached slowly, holding my hands open, saying nothing, and it eyed me. "The bird does not know him," said one of the men, he who had suggested I might be a spy of the yellows. "Be still," whispered the leader of the group. "He's a fool," whispered another. "That," said the leader, "or Gladius of Kos." The tarn, the great fierce saddle-bird of Gore, is a savage beast, a monster predator of the high blue skies of this harsh world. At best it is scarce half domesticated. Even tarnsmen seldom approach them without weapons and tarn goad. It is regarded madness to approach them when they are feeding. The instincts of the tarn, like those of many predators, are to protect and defend a kill to the death. Tarn keepers with their goads and training wires have lost their lives with even young birds trying to alter or correct this covetousness of its quarry. The winged majestic carnivores of Gore. Her tarns do not care to share their kills until perhaps they have gorged their fill, and carry then the remnants of their repast to the enclifted nests of Thentis or Voltar ranges, there to drop meat into their gaping white beaks of white tarnlings the size of ponies. "Stand back," warned the leader of the men. I stepped forward, and until I stood within the ambit of the tarn's chain. I spoke softly. "My Ubar of the skies," I said, "you know me." I approached him more closely, holding my hands open, not hurrying. The bird regarded me. In its beak there hung a yellow. "Come back!" cried one of the crossbowmen, and I was pleased to see that it was he who thought I might be a spy for the yellows. Even he did not care for what might now occur. "We must ride, Ubar of the skies," I said, approaching the bird. I took the body of the man from its beak and laid it to one side. The bird did not attempt to strike me. I heard the men behind me gasp with wonder. "You fought well," I said to the bird. I caressed its blooded, scimitar-like beak. "And I am pleased to see you live." The bird gently touched me with its beak. "Ready for the platform," I said, "for the next race." "Yes," said the leader of the men, "Gladius, of course." His 3 companions, putting aside their bows, rushed to prepare the wheeled platform. I turned to face the man, and he tossed me a leather mask, that which Gladius of Kos wore, and that which had, for so many races this fantastic summer, concealed his features. "Mip," said the man, "told me this was for you." "My gratitude," I said, drawing the mask over my head. I heard the judge's bar, a bristling firing of wings, and the sudden wild roar of the crowd. "The 8th race has begun," said the leader of the crossbowmen. I slapped the bird affectionately on the beak. "I shall see you shortly," I said, "Ubar of the skies." I strode from the bird's side and made my way through the readying compound of the Steels until I climbed the stairs inside the low wall separating it from the area leading out onto the broad path leading to the starting perches. I dropped over the wall and made my way across the sand until I came to the dividing wall separating the 2 sides of the track. I ascended the stairs there until I stood with many others on the dividing wall, and from there could watch the race. The leader of the crossbowmen in the compound of the Steels followed me. I heard cries of astonishment from those I passed. "It's Gladius of Kos," I heard. "It is he." "I thought he feared to appear." "No, fool, not Gladius of Kos." "Assassins lurk. Flee, rider, flee." "Be silent," said the man with me, quieting with his command the cries and admonitions of those around us. The bird, like some 9 of them, only a few feet overhead and to one side, flashed past, wings cracking like whips, beaks extended, the riders hunched low in the saddles. Those on the dividing wall staggered back. I caught a glimpse of Green Ubar, Mip in the saddle, lost in a flurry of whipping wings. I saw 6 wooden tarn heads mounted on poles at each end of the dividing wall, indicating the lapse remaining. Some 70 or 80 yards away I saw the box of the Ubar, and upon the throne of the Ubar, Kernus of the House of Kernus, in the imperial purple of the Ubar. For the moment his attention was distracted from the race, as a messenger, a fellow I had seen but a moment before on the dividing wall, hastened to his side, whispering something in his ear. I suddenly saw him look to the dividing wall. Masked, I stood there, facing him. Angrily he turned to the man and gave him a command. Again the furious passage of the tarns overhead was marked in the beating of wings, the cries of the riders, now the flash of tarn goads, the turbulence of the air slashed from their path driving against us. This time, in the centre side ring, a non-faction tarn was forced into the padded bar by a sudden swerve of Menicius of Port Car riding for the Yellows. I had seen him use this tactic several times before. I noted that Mip had been following Menicius, and when Menicius had swerved, Mip had taken advantage of the opening thus presented, and, like a knife, had plunged for the heart of the ring. The bird that had struck the ring was tumbling stunned into the net. The great heavy ring was swinging on its chains. Menicius, I saw, savagely drag his bird back to the centre of the flight path, cursing, realizing how Mip had waited to take advantage of his momentary surrender of the centre. The crowd, regardless of which patch they wore, cried out with admiration. A tarn of the Reds, a large winged bird, goaded almost to madness by a small bearded rider wearing a bone talisman around his neck, held the lead. He was followed by the 2 brown racing tarns, their riders wearing the silk of the blues and the silvers. Then followed Green Ubar, Mip one with the winged beast, high stirrups, his small body hunched down, not giving the bird its head. I wondered at the bird. I knew its age, the diminishment of its strength, that it had not raced in many years. Its feathers lacked the fiery sheen of the young tarn. Its beak was not the gleaming yellow of other birds, but a whitish yellow. Its breathing was not that of other birds, but its eyes were those of the unconquerable tarn, wild, black, fierce, gleaming with pride and fury, determined that no bird or beast shall stand before it. I feared for the strain on the old heart, redoubtable and valiant. "Beware!" cried my fellow, he with the crossbow, and I spun to catch the wrist of a man striking toward my back with a dagger. I broke his neck and threw him to the sand at the foot of the dividing wall. He was the man who had reported my presence to Kernus, he to whom Kernus had issued an order. I turned and regarded the box of the Ubar. Sophronicus of the Taurentian guards stood beside him. The hand of Sophronicus was on the hilt of his sword. The fists of Kernus were white, clenched on the arms of the Ubar's throne. I returned my attention to the race. My fellow now, instead of watching the race, stood armed with his back to mine, his crossbow ready. The tarns, like a torrent of beating wings and talons, swept by again. The large winged tarn had fallen back now, the lead being taken by the rider of the blue, a small, shrewd man, a veteran rider, but one too precipitate. I knew his bird. He had moved too soon. I smiled. Mip on the Green Ubar swept past the large winged tarn. Second in the race was now the rider who wore the silk of the silvers. Already he permitted his bird the freedom of the reins. I saw there were 2 tarn heads left on the poles. I did not know the strength of the bird. With a clear strike at the first of the end rings, however, the bird, headstrong, resenting the sudden pressure on the control steps, went wide. Mip took advantage of this, cutting in closely, following now the rider in blue silk. Menicius of Port Carl, riding for the Yellows, tearing at the control straps of his bird, Tarn Goad showering sparks to the sand below, Tarn screaming, fought his way, bird buffeting, past the Silver, trying to regain the centre of the rings. The Blue, leading now, expertly blocked Mip at ring after ring. I noted that the bird ridden by the rider in blue silk was tiring, but yet the race could be won on blocking. Menicius of Port Carl had been slowed by the Silver's attempt to stop him. Again and again Mip tried to pass the bird of the Blues, ring after ring, and then, lifting the bird again, he suddenly cut to the low and to the left, executing the dangerous talon pass. The bird of the Blues raked downward with his talons that could have torn Mip from the saddle, but Mip had judged the distance superbly. I heard the rider of the Blues curse, and those who favoured the steels leapt roaring to their feet. "Look," said the crossbow who stood next to me. He pointed to a spot about 100 yards away on a small wall, built itself on the dividing wall near the pole of the wooden tarn heads. I cried out with rage. There I saw a Torrentian armed with the crossbow, lifting it, preparing to fire as Mip passed through the third of the far end rings. The Torrentian had the stock of the crossbow to his shoulder, waiting. The crossbow with me said, "Do not fear." He raised his weapon to his shoulder. Mip was clearing the centre rings in the end rings when the heavy leather-wrapped cable of the crossbow sprang forward and the quarrel hissed from the guide. I watched the dark, swift flight of the quarrel like a black needle and saw it drop into the back of the Torrentian, who suddenly stiffened, seemed inches taller, the metal fins of the bolt like tiny dark triangle in the purple of the cloak, and he pitched lifeless from the wall. Mip, clearing the third end rings, streaked on. "An excellent shot," I said. The crossbowman shrugged, drawing back the heavy cable on the bow. There was now but one tarn head left on the pole. The crossbowman fitted another quarrel to his bow and stood as before, examining the crowd. The crowd roared. Mip held the lead. And then the Yellows sprang to their feet in the stands. Menicius of Port Carl, his tarn young, swift, competitive, was making his move, gaining rapidly. Mip released the reins. He didn't strike the green Ubar with the tarn goad. He shouted to him, crying encouragement. "Old warrior, fly!" he cried. I saw Green Ubar begin then to hold his lead, his wings striking with the accelerating, timed frenzy of the racing tarn. Each stroke seemed to carry him swifter and farther than the last. And then, to my horror, I saw the wings miss their beat, and the bird scream in pain and begin to turn in the air, Mip spinning with the bird, trying to control it. Menicius of Port Carl streaked past, and as he did so, his right hand flew forward, and I saw Mip suddenly loose the reins of the tarn and clutch spasmodically at his back, as though trying to reach something. Mip was thrown back on two thin safety straps of the racing saddle and then sagged in the saddle, leaning to one side. I clutched the arm of the crossbowman. The tarn of the Blues, and then of the Silvers, and then of the Reds, flashed past the reeling tarn and its rider. The crossbowman raised his weapon. "Menicius will not live to finish the race." "He is mine," I said. Suddenly Green Ubar, in the flash of wings and the cries of the riders passing him, righted himself, and with a cry of rage and pain burst toward the rings, Mip sagging in the saddle. And then the bird, which had in its time won 1,000 races and more, addressed itself again to that fierce, familiar path in the Stadium of Tarns. "Look!" I cried. "Mip lives!" Mip now hung on the neck of the Green Ubar, his body parallel to the saddle, clinging to the bird, his face pressed against it, his lips moving as if speaking to it. It's hard to say what I saw then. The crowd roared, the Tarns screamed, and Green Ubar, his rider Mip, flew, eyes blazing for those final moments, marvellous and incandescent in his youth, like a bird and rider come from the dreams of old men, as they knew them once when they too were young. Green Ubar flew. He flew. And what I saw seemed to be a young bird, in the fullness of his strength, at the pitch of his prime and pride, his cunning and swiftness, his fury and power. It was Green Ubar as I'd heard speak of him, Green Ubar of the legends, Green Ubar as he had been in the stories told by men who had seen him years before. Green Ubar, greatest of the racing Tarns, holder of awards, victorious, triumphant. When the bird came first to the perches of victory, there was no sound from the crowd, that vast multitude totally silent. Second was the startled Menicius of Port Car, the palm of victory snatched from his grip. And then all, save perhaps those closest to the noble Ubar of the city, began to cry out and cheer and pound their fists on their left shoulders. The bird stood there on the perch, and Mip straightened himself painfully in the saddle. The bird lifted its head, resplendent, fantastic, and uttered the victory cry of the Tarn, and then it tumbled from the perch into the sand. I and the crossbowmen and others raced to the perch. With my sword I cut Mip free of the safety straps and drew him from the Tarn. I jerked a small knife from his back. It was a killing knife, a legend carved around its handle. I have sought him, I have found him. I lifted Mip in my arms, and he opened his eyes. "The Tarn?" he asked. "Green Ubar is dead," I told him. Mip closed his eyes, and between the pressed eyelids there were tears. He stretched out his hand toward the bird, and I lifted him, carrying him to the side of the inert winged beast. He put his arm around the neck of the dead bird, laying his cheek against that fierce whitish-yellow beak, and he wept. We stood back. After a time the crossbowman who had stood beside me spoke to Mip. "It was victory," he said. Mip only wept. "Green Ubar," he said. "Green Ubar." "Fetch one of the caster physicians," cried an onlooker. The crossbowman shook his head negatively. Mip lay dead across the neck of the bird he had ridden to victory. The judge's bar rang twice, signalling the preparation for the 9th race, that of the Ubar. I picked up the small knife which had slain Mip, that which had been hurled by Menicius of Port Car, and I thrust it into my belt. The platforms bearing the Tarns for the 9th race were being wheeled onto the track area, approaching the starting perches. Attendants rushed forward. I picked up Mip in my arms and handed him to one of the steels. The body of Green Ubar, his Tarn, was placed on a platform and taken from the arena. The crowd was stirring in the stands. The cast colours of gore seemed turbulent in the high tiers. Men rushed here and there, securing the clay discs, confirming their bets. Hawkers cried their wares. Here and there children ran about. The sky was a clear blue dotted by clouds. The sun was shining. It was a good day for the races. On a large board against the dividing wall on which the day's results were tallied, and lists and odds kept of the coming races, I saw them place as the winner of the 8th race Green Ubar, and his rider, Melipolus of Kos. Mip, my friend, who in his day had been a famous rider apparently. Menicius of Port Car would, of course, ride in the Ubar's race for the yellows. His mount was the finest in their towncots, Quarrel, named for the missile of the crossbow, a strong bird, very fast, reddish in colour, with a discoloration on the right wing where, as talk had it, protagonists of the Silvers long ago had hurled a bottle of acid. I thought it a good bird. I respected it. But I had little doubt that my Ubar of the skies, whose name I saw posted now for the Steels, was his master. The races now stood even between the Steels and the Yellows. The Ubar's race would decide the honours of the day, and of the love feast, and, for most practical purposes, the season. I looked to the box of the Ubar, and to that of the high initiate, Complicius Serenus. Both boxes were draped with the colours of the greens. I wondered if Cairnes had yet received word of the events at the Stadium of Blades. Even now through the streets men were marching. I walked to the board where men were entering the information. There was no name following the Ubar of the skies for the Steels. "Put there," I told the men, "the name of Gladius of Cos." "He is here," cried one of them, and the other hastened to put up the name letter by letter. The crowd roared with pleasure. I saw men from the betting tables conferring, some of them then approaching the board. Odds began to shift on the great board. I heard the judge's bar ring 3 times, signalling the birds to their perches. I strode in the sunlight across the sand and towards the starting perches. I saw Menicius of Port Car standing on the platform, on which, hooded, trembling with anticipation, stood Quarrel, that marvellous reddish tarn, prince of the towncots of the Yellows. Before him, Menicius of Port Car, and surrounding the platform as well, I saw a guard of Torrentians. I approached them, but did not attempt to penetrate their line. Menicius of Port Car, his face white, climbed to the saddle of the bird. I called to him. "Gladius of Cos," I said, "following the race, would confer with Menicius of Port Car." He said nothing. "Stand away," ordered the leader of the Torrentians. "Menicius of Port Car," I said, "was in the city of Corabar during Envar of last year." Menicius' fists went white on the reins of the tarn. I took the killing knife from my belt, poising it in my fingers. "He recalls a warrior of Thentis," I remarked. "I know nothing of what he says," growled Menicius. "Or perhaps he does not recall him," I conjectured, "for I expect he saw little other than his back." "Drive him away," cried Menicius. A green patch might easily have been placed on the bridge the day before, an hour before. Menicius of Port Car is skilled with the killing knife. The strike was made doubtless from the back of a racing tarn, a small swift tarn, manoeuvrable, darting among the bridges. "You are mad," cried Menicius of Port Car. "Slay him." "The first man who moves," said the voice of the crossbowman behind me, "will swallow the bolt of a crossbow." None of the Torrentians moved against me. An attendant unhooded Quarrel, tarn of the Yellows. Its reddish crest sprang erect, and it shook its head, rippling the feathers. It lifted its head and screamed at the sun. When the attendant had unhobbled the bird, it sprang to its starting perch, the first or inside perch. It stood there, its head extended, snapping its wings. It seemed to me a fine bird. My own tarn on its platform before the fourth perch was unhooded. The crowd cried out, as it always did at the sight of that monstrous head, the wicked beak, that sable crackling crest, the round black gleaming eyes. An attendant for the steels unlocked the hobble from the fight leg of the bird and leapt aside. The steel-shod talons of the war-tarn tore for a moment at the heavy beams of the platform on which it stood, following it. And then the bird threw back its head and opened its wings and eyes gleaming, as though among the crags of the Thentis range or the Voltae, uttered the challenge scream of the mountain tarn, shrill, wild, defiant, piercing. I think there were none in that vast stadium who did not for a moment, even in the sun of summer, feel a swift chill, suddenly fearing themselves endangered, suddenly feeling themselves unwitting intruders, trespassers, wandered by accident, unwilling, into the domain of that majestic carnivore, the black tarn, my Ubar of the skies. "Mount!" cried the crossbowman, and I did so. I would miss Mip at my stirrup, his grin, his advice, the counsel, his cheery words, the last slap at my stirrup. But I remembered him only now, as he had held the saddle of the green Ubar, dying, but his hands lifted in victory. I looked across to Menicius of Port-Car. His eyes darted from mine. He bent over the neck of Quarrel. I saw that he had been given another knife, a tarn knife, of the sort carried by riders. In his right hand, ready, there was a tarn goad. To my surprise, I noted, coiled at the side of his saddle, in 4 loops, a whip knife, of the sort common in Port-Car. A whip, but set into its final 18 inches, arranged in sets of 4, 20 thin, narrow blades. The tips of whip knives differ. Some have a double-edged blade of about 7 or 8 inches at the tip, and others have a stunning lead, which fells the victim and permits him, half conscious, to be cut into pieces at the attacker's leisure. The whip knife of Menicius, however, held at its tip the double-edged blade, capable of cutting a throat at 12 feet. I noted the Torrentians going to the other contestants in the race, conveying messages to them. Some of these men were protesting, shaking their fists. "It would be well," said my crossbowman, standing by my stirrup, "not to fall behind in this race." I saw a Torrentian bring Menicius of Port-Car a container wrapped in silk, which he thrust into his belt. "Look," I said to the crossbowman, indicating Torrentians carrying crossbows who were slipping into the crowd. "You race," he said to me. "There are those of ours among the tiers." I took the great tarn up with a snap of his wings to my starting perch, the 4th. Menicius of Port-Car no longer seemed white, no longer afraid. His lean face was now calm, and there was a cruel smile around his lips and his eyes. He looked to me and laughed. I readied myself for the sound of the judge's bar. The starting rope was strung before the tarns. I noted to my surprise that the padding on the rings had been removed by attendants and replaced with blade-like edges, used not in races, but in exhibitions of daring riding stunts in effect, in which riders appear to court death at the rings. The crowd, all factions, cried out in protest at this. The riders, with the exception of myself and Menicius of Port-Car, looked from one to the other warily, puzzled. "Bring me," I said to the crossbowman standing at the foot of the perch, "from the belongings of Gladius of Cos, kept in the compound of the Steels, the bowler of the 2 chooks, the Caïla rope, and the southern quiver." He laughed. "I wondered when you would understand that you ride to war." And I smiled at him under my mask. An attendant of the Steels threw up a package to my saddle, and I laughed. "We had them ready," said the crossbowman. Another man, one of the Steels, who had ridden to victory earlier in the day, ran to the foot of the perch. "There are townsmen," he said, "Torrentians, but in plain garb, gathered outside the stadium." I had expected as much. Such men doubtless had been used in the attack on the caravan of the Hinrabians. "Bring me," I said, "the small hornbow of the Tuchuks, the barbed war arrows of the wagon peoples." "These too are at hand," said the crossbowman. "How is it," I asked, "these things are ready?" "Mip," said the crossbowman, by way of explanation. "He well knew the race you would ride." An attendant from beneath his cloak threw to the saddle the tiny swift bow of the Tuchuks, the narrow rectangular quiver with its 40 arrows. Not hurrying, I strung the bow. It is small, double-curved, about 4 feet in length, built up of layers of boscorn, bound and reinforced with metal and leather. It is banded with metal at 7 points, including the grip, metal obtained from Turia in half-inch rolled strips. The leather is applied diagonally in 2-inch strips, except that, horizontally, it covers the entire grip. The bow lacks the range both of the longbow and the crossbow, but at close range, firing rapidly, it can be a devastating weapon. Its small size, like the crossbow, permits it to clear the saddle, shifting from the left to right, or to the rear with equal ease, and this providing an advantage lacked by the more powerful but larger crossbow. But like the longbow, and unlike the crossbow, which requires strength and time to reset, it is capable of a considerable volume of fire. A Tuchuk warrior can, in swirling from the saddle of a running Kaila, accurately fire arrows drawn to the point in half an een. The small bow, interestingly, has never been used among townsmen. Perhaps this is because the Kaila is almost unknown above the equator, and the lesson of Kaila back has not been much available to them. Perhaps it is of tradition, which weighs heavily in Korean life, even in military affairs. For example, the phalanx was abandoned only after more than a century of attempts to preserve and improve it. Or perhaps the reason is that range is commonly more important to townsmen in flight than maneuverability. I suspect, however, that the truest reason is that townsmen, never having learned respect for the small bow, tend to despise such a weapon, regarding it as unworthy of a warrior's hand, as being too puny and ineffective to win the approval of a true Korean fighting man. Some of the riders of the Steels, I recalled, seeing it among the belongings of Gladius of Kos, had jested with me about it, asking if it were a toy, or perhaps a training bow for a child. These men, of course, had never met Tuchuks on Kaila back, and it is just as well for them. It seemed to me that combat on Kaila back and combat on town back had much in common. I suspected that the small bow, though it had never been proven in battle on town back, might prove that it had worth in the Korean skies as well as on the dusty southern plains. I had further, in many nights of training with my Tarn, taught it to respond to a variety of voice commands, thus freeing my hands for the use of weapons. Commonly the Tarn responds only to one voice command, that of tabuk, which tends roughly to mean hunt and feed. Further, I would have liked to use the Tuchuk Temwood thrusting lance from the saddle of the Tarn. The townsman commonly carries strapped to the saddle a Korean spear, a fearsome weapon, but primarily a missile weapon, and one more adopted to infantry. The townsman, of course, centuries before, had been developed from land forces. It had always seemed to me that the town cavalries of Gore might considerably improve by a judicious alteration of weapons and training practices. However, I had never had command of a townsman group of my own, and my ideas were of little interest even to the townsmen of Cordoba, my city.